All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Good to see you all here today. It's April 9th. You know what that means? I'm asking. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means anything in particular, but I didn't know if it was somebody's special birthday or anything like that. It's just April 9th. It's just regular old April 9th. What a terrible day, April 9th. There's nothing special happening today? Nothing? Okay. Well, we'll pray for April 9th. And as we look into chapter 5 today, starting prayer, I recognized after last week, Dan was so kind afterwards, Pastor Dan was kind to say, hey, you know that next week is 1 week, and then the next week is Holy Week. And I didn't, actually. I forgot that. I thought that there were 2 weeks before Holy Week. So if it's okay with the group, we will not finish today. We'll meet next week, and then that'll be our last one. We'll finish we'll move through chapter 5, and then next week chapter 6 is pretty tight and easy, and then do Easter stuff. So sorry for my failure to keep time. That seems to be a recurring theme in all of this. We'll look at chapter 5, unpack anything that drew your attention. The notion of prayer, or the practice of prayer, and why that's important. It's one of the longer chapters in her book. And then the last chapter, God or God images, is the shortest chapter, which is mostly like a recapitulation of some things that pulls out some different themes. And so that's where we're at. We'll open with prayer, and then we'll get to any things that kind of popped out at you that you want to highlight or extract, and we'll make sure that we cover those. And other than that, if you got questions or comments online, welcome. Dan's here. Sean's in the back with the sound and the video. Let's pray. So, Holy Spirit, in this Lenten season, as we continue to hear stories of your great love, might we fast from our anger and disdain and discomfort. Might we be receptive to your Holy Spirit guiding us. Might we be open to Christ giving us a good word to feast upon. And so might it be found in our time together, or perhaps in the day that unfolds. We trust that we are guided by your Spirit. It is in the name of the one who wandered the desert for our sake. Amen. Anything from chapter 5 that was notable or of interest to you as she talks more about prayer, introspective, kapathatic, apathatic traditions, naming, non-naming, the cloud of unknowing? Anything come out of that was of interest to you all? Great. Well then, session over. If nothing is, no, I'm kidding. She opens. When she starts talking, I did want to kind of highlight something here. The word passion originates from the Latin word passio. And so why that's important is, again, I feel like we spent a lot of time on the passions, and in part because I hope that they weren't overly confusing, because we have such baggage and associations with the word passion today. We encourage our students, our young people, or even adults, follow your passion. What are you passionate about? And go do those things. But the word passion comes from this word which actually means suffering. Passio means to suffer, or something that's being acted upon. So again, like you can think about the passion of the Christ, right? This wasn't like a hooray, you know what I mean? Like it wasn't that at all. It's a type of suffering that is being kind of put upon one. And so all that to say, as a reminder, as she unpacks prayer as a tool or a way to address the passions, it's not the tool or the way to discover what are you most charged up about, right? What are you most excited about? Or what draws you to love most deeply? It's rather what are the things that cause you to suffer, or what are the things that blind or bind you? What are your passions? And so rather than a passion of the Christ, maybe there's the passion of Mark, or like put your own name in there, right? What is your passion? And I would also offer up that many times part of the Deceptiveness of passions is that passions are often understood as problems, but most of the time, passions are really solutions to problems. They're terrible solutions. They're bad solutions. They're not helpful solutions. But the reason that we're drawn to them is because we're convinced that they work on some level. The father who comes home from work and is all, in a stereotypical sense, is all kind of bound up because they can't say anything to their jerk boss, comes home and kicks the dog. And that works, right, to get him through another day, right? Or drinks the sauce out throughout the night, and you know what I mean? Like, drunkenness becomes like a passion because it works. It's not a problem. It's a solution to a problem. And that's what makes it so really difficult to dislodge, because you actually have to see that this solution is not a good solution, even though it kind of works, you know? Does that make sense? And that's kind of the genius of the diabolical, or genius of the passions, is that if they didn't work at all, it would be so easy to quit that. You know, like if they didn't work at all, that would be easy. That's not, if your hands are covered in tar, and you wouldn't even try to use water because it wouldn't work to get the tar out. Like, you know that wouldn't work, right? But if you had some sort of substance that kind of worked, you know, you'd scrub all day because it kind of works, you know? And you'd give up searching for an alternate solution, if you will, to remove the tar. Does that make sense? So as a reminder, a lot of the desert folks and the theologians, the radical theologians that I read today even, talk about passions or problems, and we tend to think of those problems as problems that need to be solved, but most of the complexities of our world, or the problems that we encounter, aren't really problems. They're just really, really terrible solutions, and we've settled for that solution. So a shared person that one of our participants here and I read, his name is Peter Rollins, he gives the example of homelessness. We think that homelessness is a problem, but it's not a problem. It's just a terrible solution that we've settled on, right? We tolerate some amount of homelessness as like, well, you know, we've done our part, and we'll just, you know, there will always be homeless people, you know, and we just settle with, like, that's an acceptable solution on some level, right? And so it's rarely, let's not eradicate homelessness. It's what level of homelessness are we okay with is usually what it is, right? So this might help also when Jesus says, the poor will always be with you, right? This isn't an admonition that says, well, what are you going to do? You know, you should just kind of fall into nihilism. There's always going to be poor people. No, he's critiquing this idea, this mindset, this worldview that you and I carry around that accept poverty as a solution, right? As long as you always think that some level or some amount of people are going to be poor, guess what? The poor will always be with you, right? Because you're always going to allow, well, should we have poverty at 2% of the population or 1% of the population? Right? Nobody's talking about how do we eradicate poverty. And in fact, when we do, it's kind of laughed at. Like, that's an insurmountable sort of problem. No, it's an insurmountable solution because it's embedded in the hearts of us. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? The passions are very, very tough. And it's really almost, I would say, impossible for you to dislodge the passion on your own, which is why this chapter of prayer it follows that, right? That prayer is the means by which God has offered God's self to aid and assist the uprooting or the dislodgement of the passions, because we've convinced ourselves that these passions actually aren't that bad, right? Does that make sense? That's kind of a long-winded wind-up as to, like, you can see how it moves from this extended kind of taxonomy of passions and then into this, okay, so why are we talking about prayer now? That doesn't make sense. Is prayer the solution to the passions? No. Prayer's not the solution to the passions, right? Prayer is the means by which we open our hearts to God uprooting and helping us see that those passions are really terrible solutions, right? So a lot of prayer language is about opening our eyes and opening our hearts, like opening, become aware of things, right? Okay. So she writes in the very, how do we fight these passions, right? Our early monastic forebears had many ways to do this, but two were prayerful introspection and prayer itself. So she dissects two things, introspection and prayer. So on 78, she talks about, just very briefly, introspection means looking inside ourselves to see what makes us tick or fail to make us tick that we may love. This kind of does anybody do this? I'm guessing that we're in a pretty introspective world these days. A lot of self-help stuff is about introspection, kind of like looking at who you are, what you're about, all these personality tests and learning about yourself. Every Cosmo quiz you've ever taken is some form of introspection, right? And so it's a pretty common practice here, or at least the practice of knowing about this, perhaps not the way that the desert folks did it. But she goes on page 79 to say, being able to look at the second paragraph there, being able to look inside ourselves and see what's going on is a crucial part of breaking part of the passions. Why that might be an obvious thing, but it's important to also, I think it's a nice little segue for you to know, or for us to know, that it is true that your health, your spiritual health, your emotional health, your physical health, your health depends on someone dying. It depends on it. Now, do you know who that someone dying is? Do you know who has to die so that you might be healthy and whole and complete, as it were? It's called you. You have to die. Your ego, your own sense, are you with me? Your pride, like you have to die for you to be healthy. Does that make sense? And so for her to write, being able to look inside ourselves and see what's going on is a crucial part of breaking free of this passions. If we're seeking some sort of resurrection or transformation or regeneration or whatever word you want to utilize, new life, new birth, right? On that baptismal kind of arc, if you're seeking this, if you're seeking love and pursuing love, and you're going to be transformed or remade or reborn, something has to die. And that something, that someone is you. The you that you think you are, right? And most of the time, most of us, most days, do not want to do this because the you that you think you are has been successful enough to get you where you are. Does that make sense? And so it's that old idea of, what brought you here won't take you there, right? So it's in some ways your identity of who you think you are is the very thing that is impeding you to move to Christ. Does that make sense? The thing that you think you are, your identity, whatever it is actually the impediment to transformation. That's why Paul in Scripture talks a lot about, I was this. Well, I died to all of that. I was a Pharisee of Pharisees. I was, here's my CV, here's my resume. All that is rubbish. I consider it all a loss, trash. He uses he actually uses the word, essentially our word, he uses the word bullshit to describe all of that. Like it is so not worth anything. But what's really nice about that phrase is that manure becomes the material that God uses to sprout forth new life, right? Does that make sense? So the thing that you are discarding, we think in dichotomies, that when we die to ourselves and we're going to be this new thing or this other thing, then the old is forever gone. That's not what Paul is suggesting. He's actually saying that old becomes the seedbed by which the new comes out of. You actually need that old stuff. You need the bullshit for the fertile soil to grow. Does this make sense? So this is why you wrestle. This is why you wrestle. We tassel. We don't seek to what's the right word? Banish the passions, right? Like dislodge them from our hearts completely, right? But we learn to befriend them because they have something to teach us. They actually become the bullcrap of our lives that we are able to let go of, so that a new thing might spring forth of. So I know that's a little esoteric, and if you get into there's a little book called The Cloud of Unknowing. This might make a little more sense, but okay. So this idea of being able to look inside yourself, we have to be able to look inside ourselves to know what's the me, what's the thing, what's the person that has to die here in this thing. You can think about it in your own, just like interpersonal relationships, if you're ever in an argument with somebody, and if you can pause, I don't know if you can because it's super hard, pause and just kind of take a breath and think, like when you're in a heated argument, what's the thing that has to die here, right? And generally, if you're in a heated argument and you forget to do that, you think, I know what needs to die, and it's you. You just need to shut up. You need to admit that you're wrong. Like it's always an outward projection, the you. Perhaps. But that introspection is very, very difficult to do because it's asking you to look to really look inward and to assess, like what is the thing that is blinding and binding me now that's keeping me from breaking free, as she says, breaking free. What liberation am I needing? And so on page 79, she talks about how part of the process is to notice whether certain passions appear at the same time each day, right? Did you catch this? Like these passions are, in some way, they are without mind or without soul or without spirit, right? In many ways, they're leech. They latch on like a barnacle. They don't really have a sense of their own selves. The only way that they can exist is because you exist, And so you're able to, so in introspection, that's where you're able to kind of assess, what times of the day do I notice I'm getting my most whatever, be it anger. I'm experiencing the passions the most, right? So these pattern recognitions is the first part of introspection. It's a very, very simple process. She advocates journaling. She does all of those things. But it's less about who did this to me, right? And just being keyed into, I notice that when I am peckish at any point in the day, like when I'm hungry, right? Then I get whatever, sleepy, angry, agitated, whatever, right? I get this thing. So if you're able to note that, then the self-help folks will say, cool, all you got to do then is like take a breath and be mindful or whatever, or eat something, right? The desert folks might offer an alternative remedy and say, cool, well, if you know that when you are peckish, you get angry, that means you should probably fast a little more. Does that make sense? You should actually engage in the practice of fasting, right? Like intentionally choose fasting so that it's a controlled environment that I'm going to fast from A to B, and the reason I'm fasting is to practice that feeling of peckishness in a more controlled environment rather than it kind of arising up within me without my sense of knowing. Does that make sense? So the desert folks, that's part of their effort to fast wasn't because they were into this like, I don't know, whatever we're into whenever we fast, whatever. They're actually trying to practice to be introspectively aware of what their physical being feels like when they are peckish. What is the earliest sign that they notice? I got a little twitch in my hand. Or you know what I mean? Does this make sense? So whenever you practice the fast, then when you break the fast or you eat or consume something, then you're able to look back and reassess, what did I really experience through all of that, right? Versus if you're not fasting and you get peckish and those same feelings happen and you're completely disembodied from it, then you're just reactive to it. Then you're ensnared by the passions. Then you're going to be angry. Then you're going to be upset. Then you're going to be whatever. And you won't have any sense of agency to tame those passions because you don't have any practice. It's just coming up upon you, right? So if you're tired of yelling or arguing with your spouse because you come home or your friend or whatever, and you're at a bar or you're at a meal or whatever, and you guys always get into an argument, and we're like, okay, that's it. We're just not going to talk politics, or we're not going to do the thing or whatever, right? Fine. Again, all the self-help world will tell you that's the way to do that. The desert folks will say, that's a way, that's fine. It sounds to me like that passion has dominion over you and is now dictating how you're going to live your life outside of that moment, so hooray, they're crushing you, right? desert folks might say something like, here's what you ought to do. Start reading exclusively stuff that pisses you off. If you hate MSNBC, watch MSNBC exclusively and pay attention to all of the, don't pick apart their arguments, that's not the point, but like pay attention to how does this feel in you? This, like does the anger or does the discomfort start low or does it start here? Like, you know what I mean? So that whenever you are walking through your daily life and somebody says something that triggers you, you have some practice of dealing with those things so that when you are, again, with the passions start where? In the heart, and then they move to the mind, then the mouth, then the action, right? If you're out in the street and somebody says something that really triggers you, you don't have any practice. And so, of course, you're going to lash out in words or actions. Right? So the desert folks. I know it might sound crazy, but like that's their prescription, if you will, is to actually go all the way through it, go all the way into it. We tend to come to some sort of resistance, and like, oh, okay. That's far enough, right? But desert folks, radical theologians say, no, that's not the problem. The problem isn't that you hit resistance. The problem is that you retreated from that resistance. The problem is you didn't push far enough. You have to go all the way through it. And that takes some time, and that takes some courage. And that's generally why you fast with a group. Or, like you engage these practices with a group and say, hey, how's MSNBC going for you these days? Or whatever whatever the thing is, right? Okay. Does that make sense? It's a different way of engaging with these things, these passions that have so much control and dominion over you, is to actually not just satiate them with a little bit of like when your dog is barking, just a little bit of meat, and then they'll be quiet for a little bit. Or if you have a kid that's going bonkers and you just give them an iPhone, and then they're like zoned out for a minute, and you just have some quiet time, right? That's fine, but those are all Band-Aids, right? Those are just all Band-Aids. They're not actually addressing this other thing. And that other thing, these passions, they're going to bubble up in you in ways that you will never expect. Have you ever just been enraptured in an emotion that's so intense and you didn't even see it coming? Has anybody ever experienced that? Like you're just walking through your day or driving your car and somebody does something and for whatever reason, your reaction is completely disproportionate to the action that they did. Has anybody ever experienced? Is it just me? Maybe I'm the asshole, Sean. Maybe it's just me. I think it's just me. But like if anybody's ever experienced something and then your reaction is disproportionate to the action that was taken, surprise, right? That suggests that you have very limited practice with this passion, with tasseling with this passion, and it has way more control over you, so much so that one person who you will never ever see again can walk on a sidewalk and make you mad. You know what I mean? Like, you're not that strong. You're not that good. You're not that noble. You're not that pious. So that's why these practices are important. That's why prayer is important, because it gives you set a time, practice time for whenever you don't get to choose when the passions attack you. On page 80, she says, she talks a little bit about journaling, of course. That's great. I'm not much of a journaler. I don't, because I get caught up in like my spelling and my grammar, and I've been berated over my years that I'm not good at writing, and I know that I'm not good at writing, and I'm afraid that somebody might find this journal and make fun of me because I can't spell the word angel and angle. I get them all backwards, and so I'm not much of a journaler. One of the things that I have found helpful, though, is talking to myself in the third person. Does anybody do this? I know this sounds crazy, but there's a lot of psychological research that's around this, where journaling is nice because you're able to have that remove of self, right? You talk about yourself on the page, right? I don't do that. Very good. Well, what I am more comfortable with is verbal processing. I do that a lot. I'm doing it now, which is why we're always late, right? So rather than journaling, another practice that I've encountered and have it's been helpful for me is to talk to myself in the third person. Not talk about myself in the third person. Oh, Jason's very cold right now. Nothing like that. But rather say questions like, hey, Jason, I noticed that you're doing X or whatever. Or, hey, Jason, remember that when this happens, right? Talk to yourself as though you're talking to a friend, right? That has asked you to be their accountability buddy. And that sounds silly and it sounds dumb, and that's part of the beautiful passion that will destroy that practice because it's tapping into your ego. That's why I don't journal, right? Because my ego, which is ridiculous, right? I mean, it's just ridiculous. Nobody's gonna read that journal. But my own ego is like, you can't spell, you suck. But you're gonna if you do a verbal thing and you're talking to yourself in the third person, that can be very, very potent practice of identifying where these passions arise themselves up in your life. And then you are able to actually rebuke or speak against that thing, right? That passion, right? As though it's a person, it's an entity. Like, I see you, gossip. I see you, avarice. I see, like they have names. You can call them a name. I see you. I recognize you. What news do you have for me today? Thank you. You can go to the corner now, right? You know what I mean? It sounds stupid. It sounds silly, but give it a shot. She also talks about seeking a spiritual director on page 80. Does anybody have a spiritual director? You got a spiritual director? Anybody else have a spiritual director? We have counselors, right? Those are common, or therapists, and all of that is good. Spiritual direction is different than counseling. It's different than therapy. It does a different task and a different function. And we can talk more about that later, but you can just Google, or if you want to search spiritual direction, ? And it will give you kind of a synopsis of what is spiritual direction and how is spiritual direction different from therapy or counseling or a trusted friend. But she talks a lot about seeking your own Amma or your own Abba, right? Seeking this person or person out. I did appreciate on page 80 at the bottom here that story of Abba Poman. A brother went to see Abba Poman and said to him, "What ought I do?" And the old man said, "Go and join one who says, 'What do I want?' and you will have peace." I really like this saying as well, as a reminder that oftentimes we're looking for what do we want to do, right? What's the next action to take? Are you with me? What do I want to do in the world? It's all about this action bias. And again, the way that the passions work is that the action comes later, right? The passion starts in the heart, and then it moves to the mind, and then mouth, and then hands, right? So this idea that you're focusing on your doing, that's fine, but it never will address. It might address your mouth or your hands, but it's not going to address your mind or your heart. So you're able to shift the question less about what you're doing and back to your desires. What is your desire, right? What do you want? Because if you know what you want, then you're able to assess which one of these options of doing is the right option, the good option, the faithful option, the helpful option. When you go down the cereal aisle at your store, you know you want to eat breakfast, right? And whenever you think about that, great. That means you might still choose Cookie Crisps, as the cereal to take home. Or you might ask, what I really want is to have a healthy breakfast. And so maybe I won't actually go down the cereal aisle, right? And I'm going to go find some $40 eggs or whatever the thing is, right? So there's a lot of focus on the doing and the action, but the desert folks, again, that's like tertiary and fourth level stuff, like what you're doing. It's what do you want? What is your desires? What's in it is in your heart and in your mind. Pay attention to that. There's an old story of Rabbi Akiva, I think is his name. Anyway, he's walking, he gets lost in the wilderness, he finds this fort, this soldier says, "Who are you and what do you want?" And Rabbi says, "What do they pay you?" Have you heard this story? What do they pay you? And he says, "What is that?" He says, "What do they pay you? What do they pay you to ask that question?" keep guard. And the guy says, well, they pay me 2 gold coins a day. And the rabbi's like, awesome. I'll tell you what, I will double your pay if you stand outside of the door of my house and ask me those same questions every time I go in and every time I go out. Who are you and where are you going, right? These are more in the latter, like not what are you doing, but what is your desire? Like, who are you? Who are you really? And if you remember that you're a child of God and that you're not God, right? Or that you're a person that puts their pants on one leg at a time, not the CEO of some big old company that everybody bows to, right? Like, who are you and where are you going? These are why questions, not or want questions rather than doing questions, right? The top of 81, if a spiritual director isn't available for you, this is where KUMC might be helpful in that we have these connection groups or spiritual formation groups. If you're interested to learn more about spiritual formation, actually, Jeff you can visit with Jeff. There's a new group that's starting here that's just around spiritual formation, which is different than Bible study, which is different from theology class. It's just what is spiritual formation. And so Susie has a spiritual director. You can talk with Susie more about spiritual direction. You can talk with Jeff about the new group that's talking about spiritual formation. But Christian community is a big part. If you can't find an Abba or an Amma, or you think that that's odd or weird, then within community, within a construct of a social gathering, within a Christian context, you're able to then explore these practices together. Also on page 82, she writes, on page 82, shifting the questions from how are you to give me a word, she talks about how, and I can't remember where these are, and I apologize, but in the desert tradition, the student would find the teacher, and the student would always ask the same question, and that is, Abba or Amma, would you give me a word? Would you give me a word? I never really understood that until one day I was in the restroom at a church in Fort Worth, Texas, and I walked into the restroom, and there was a homeless man. It was downtown Fort Worth. There was a homeless man there, and I had a little name tag on that said Reverend, whatever. And he looked at me and he said, Reverend? I said, I'm Jason. He said, no, Reverend. No, what's the word today? What's the word today? And that was really unsettling to me because I was trying to use the restroom, first off. But secondly, I didn't expect that script. Hey, how are you? Hey, the toilet's out. Hey, whatever, no soap. Like there's all sorts of scripts, right, in that encounter. But for a guy to ask a pastor, hey, what's the word today? I was really embarrassed that I had nothing. I was flummoxed. I was caught off guard. Wesley said preachers, Wesley preachers need to be willing to preach, pray, or die at any point in time. And I was like, I probably should just die right now because I don't have a word. Like I don't know what to preach. So this idea though of moving the script, like what's the word that you have today? That assumes that God is actually active in this world. That assumes that you are listening to God in this world. Paul, Nancy, what's the word that you have today? Like that would be really remarkable. In lots of circles, we talk a lot about like, how is it with your soul? And that's great, and that's good. That's also kind of like, I don't know, that feels a little self-disclosure. I don't really know. And people kind of end up receiving that question of, how are you doing today? That's usually how that question gets interpreted. But if the question isn't, how is it with your soul? But what have you heard from God today? What word have you been given today? Whew, you better be prepared, right? You better be prepared. I'll be honest with you, I don't know what I said to the guy. I'm confident that I said some sort of desert story, like I really am, because I remember the only reason I was down there was to do doctoral studies, and so I was probably knee deep in this, and whatever was the last story I told, and I'm sure that he looked at me and was like, that makes no sense, and then he left, but I like blacked that out, like I don't know what I said. I was like, on page 82, so so picking up on this, Abbas and Ammas, the first full paragraph there. Of course, our friends cannot really be Abbas and Ammas as much as the desert folk knew them. Abbas and Ammas were expected to be much farther along in the Christian life than their disciples. The ancient teachers were asked for obedience from the disciples who were being trained in rigorous ways of life. The teacher knew far more about than the student. And I think that's where this kind of touches on why there's probably not that many desert or that many Abbas or Ammas today, right? We don't find a lot of folks that are further on the road. We talk a lot about companionship and sojourners and, walk with me. But finding folks that are down the road and down the road enough that you can see them, right? And have access to them, that's much harder to come by. It's just harder to come by. She goes on to say, down at the very bottom here, the last full paragraph, somehow, in most of our churches, we are not prepared to take enough risks with each other. That really punched me in the gut, that idea, which it punched me because I think that it's very true. I think that it is very true. That even within our churches, in most churches, we're not prepared to take enough risks with each other. And what? Say more. How do you move? How do you move the needle on being prepared to take more risks with another? What do you think? So there's some response of, well, how do we get to do that? Well, you got to spend time with folks, right? And kind of till the soil a little bit and build some trust, right? Mm-hmm. Being empathetic, right? Hearing whatever they say and responding to that. That's good. Mm-hmm. I would offer up also something that we're probably afraid to say. Be the first one. That's the thing. There's a really iconic video in the Sasquatch Music Festival back in 2000 and whatever, and there is a crazy guy with his shirt off in a field dancing. Like, I'm sure that this guy is chemically out of his brain, right? And he's just going to town in this festival. And then another guy who is unrelated, not friends, he shows up and starts dancing with this person, Well, what's really interesting about this whole video, have you guys seen this? Sean, have you seen this? Dan, what's really interesting about, you can search Sasquatch Music Festival dance or whatever. What's really fascinating about it, which Dan often does, is that the guy that's dancing by himself dances by himself for a long time. And then the guy that joins him, the two of them dance by themselves for a little bit until a third person comes. And once that third person comes, it comes exponentially shorter until eventually the whole field is on fire with people dancing, right? Chances are, there are people in your group or in this church that are willing to take a risk, that are willing to be the first. They come in, they had some terrible thing happen to them in the week, right? And their countenance is clear. They are not doing well, right? They are dancing alone. It takes some courage, for sure, to do that. But sometimes the weight is so overwhelming, it just is going to bubble out of you regardless, right? So the person that is dancing alone, it does take some courage. But the person that ignites the movement isn't the first dancer, it's the first follower, right? It's that person that recognizes that person is alone. If they're dancing or not, that person is alone, and I am willing to be a fool for them, right? Because I was helping filming how this crazy guy dancing by himself, right? But today, usually, we see somebody with a particular countenance or some vulnerability, somebody who's willing to take a risk in a community, and we think, maybe they just want their space, right? I don't know how to engage with this. And so our default position becomes we actually don't take a risk, right? We don't take a risk because we don't want to look foolish or we don't want to offend, right? I don't know if you've read much of Scripture, and I'm not trying to talk down to you, but a lot of Jesus's words and actions lead with potential offense. Like that's the irony of love is that's the risk that love takes, is that sometimes it is offensive. Sometimes you put your foot in your mouth. Sometimes you make a mistake. That's true. So I would suggest or argue perhaps that at Keller UMC we have lots of lone dancers. We have an abundance of them every Sunday, every time you come into this space. Being the lone dancer does take courage, but there are always people who come here when their world is falling apart and they don't know where else to go, right? The courage to be prepared to take more risks is to be the second dancer, the first follower, to actually pursue that person and say, hey, I noticed, and maybe I misread the situation, but I want to let you know that you were noticed here, and in this place, everyone is welcomed. My name is Jason, and I don't know what's going on in your life, but here's my number, and I'm always here every Sunday. If you ever need to call and just talk, just want to let you know that you're loved here. You know, you don't even have to say I love you. You can say, just want to let you know you're loved here. Like that takes some courage. That takes some risks, and that feels weird. But I think that's what it takes, is to be the first follower, or to that's one of the things to address it. On page, I don't know if I, okay. She goes on to say on 82, fear of, in this vein, right, near the bottom third or bottom fifth of this page, fear of judgmentalism is not the problem most of the time, however. Church groups many times radiate such an air of real Christians don't have problems, or if you love the Lord, you rejoice always, that there's very little room for truthfulness among people who need to be able to be truthful with each other in order to grow into real love, right? This is an example I would offer up. This is like a fear of fundamentalism is not the problem most of the time. Rather, there's little room for truthfulness among people who need to be able to be truthful with each other. I would suggest that this is a really nice example of how our politics of euphemism is really like hurting us quite a bit. Fear of fundamentalism, this idea of I'll offer this. So part of risk taking, as we're talking about in this section, right? What does it take to take a risk to be with somebody? What does that look like? Is to actually speak directly to the thing and stop using euphemisms. My uncle-in-law, Este's uncle, tragically died from a chimenea explosion. Okay, and from that he died painfully, burn. It was really terrible. And he died in the month of March. Now, when Mike died, they had a funeral for him. And it was in Oklahoma. There's this Irish Catholic priest that presided over. Bells and smells, the pall, the whole thing. First words out of this priest's mouth at the homily time. Now, mind you, I'm a know-it-all seminarian, young pastor, like I know what I'm doing. And so I sit with great judgment as I listen to this priest say, out of his mouth, after the scriptures are read, say, friends, our beloved Michael is dead. I was shocked, because you don't say that. He's passed away. He's transitioned on. You know what I mean? We have all these euphemisms. But this priest repeated the phrase, Michael is dead, 4 other times, 5 times total. I will never forget it. And I thought, what a heartless son of a gun. I could not have been farther from the truth. my ability to understand the horrific nature of Michael's death was because that priest didn't pussyfoot around with euphemistic language that tried to, make it some sort of, chicken soup for the soul. Yeah. Like, he just stated what it is. Michael is dead. And when I had to confront the reality of that, and I had to do that in the community of others, it actually made it less terrifying than when I was by myself. When I lit for the first time 2 years later a chimenea, you can be darn sure that I was terrified, right? But I knew from that whole experience around Michael's death, and this priest being very clear on what had happened, that I took a ton of precautions, right? And I even lit it, and I offered a prayer for Mike, right? So this euphemistic language is incredibly problematic, and it actually keeps us from risking, because we're going to use euphemisms all of the time to blunt any sort of trauma that we have with existence. And therefore, when we have to confront the trauma of existence by ourselves, we ain't got no practice. And then we fall apart because I'm 80 years old and my wife is dead and I don't know what to do now because everybody else my whole life has told me people just pass away, whatever the hell that means, right? Does this make sense? To your point around how do we prepare to take risks, I would suggest that we've got to also be willing to let go of euphemisms. They are not helpful. They're polite, but they're not healthy. They're not faithful. So it is also, to build on that, it is also why the desert tradition, a lot of what they have to say is pretty harsh. I mean, it's very direct. For those of you who are reading some of these stories, it's like, whoa, why do you have to be such an a-hole about that? You don't have to be that, gruff about it. But no, they're avoiding that euphemistic talk, and they're speaking plainly so that we can plainly confront reality, to give us practice, so that when reality comes knocking at our door like a thief in the night, we have some practice grappling with it, and it doesn't just knock our wind out. A buddy of mine said that his mother was being put in a memory care unit, and he said, "Isn't that the most terrible language? They're not caring for her memories in the slightest. We should be calling we should call it a loss of memory facility, because that's what it is. My mother, or his grandmother, has dementia, Alzheimer's. She's losing her memory. They're not caring for her memories. They're not trying to log things down. But it makes those of us who have to make those difficult decisions, it makes it sound better to us, right? It blunts the trauma of this one whom I love, who raised me, who raised my mom, or whatever, right? I don't know what to do with this. I do not know how to care for this person, and I am completely impotent and powerless in the face of this overwhelming reality, and I don't know what to do with it. And somebody comes along and says, "Don't worry, we have a memory care facility," that softens the blow, right? If any place opened up by saying, "Just so you know, this is the loss of memory care facility," I'm not sure that will fit on the business card, much less make the marquee. You know what I mean? Because it's gonna confront people with the reality that their loved one. You know what I mean? Like, we're using all these euphemisms just to protect us from the reality that's there, and therefore we are more and more ill-equipped to handle the weight of the world, right, as it comes to us. Our muscles atrophy. So Jonathan Haidt, his book, The Anxious Generation, he's writing a lot about this these days, right? That so much of our time is spent on these screens and these phones and these devices that pull us out of reality, right? I have no idea if it's good or bad, but I do know that that's not a new practice. All of us confronting the harshness of reality have always found ways to escape. And using screens these days is our generation's scapegoat, but guess what? You do it too. We all are blunting the trauma of reality through euphemisms and escapes. There's no way on God's green earth that Regis Philbin could have possibly created a television show, game show that was that popular, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, if we all weren't looking to blunt the trauma of reality after September the 11th. You remember? Like, that's a dumb show. I mean, but yet we all tuned in, right? Because we all needed some sort of bluntness or some sort of cushion to the confronting of reality. Okay. So euphemism. Be mindful of how much euphemistic language you use. That's another a treatment. On 83, she talks about in our search for friends with whom we can grow with, we must be prepared to state our need openly to people who may be embarrassed by it. This is where I come back to building on euphemistic language. Whenever, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, I experienced this with some level of reality almost every day. Somebody will come to the church or call the office and they say, hey, Pastor Jason, things are kind of tight, we're having some difficult times these days. Can the church help? Right? I mean, that's there's those are very difficult conversations because I have no idea what that really means or what the need is. Because it's so euphemistic, it's so vague, and it's so general that whenever I bring that to finance committees or any pastors or whatever, they're like, well, what's the need? What's the need? Well, they have some level of shame or embarrassment articulating that, right? And so that's why we use some of this euphemistic language. I lost my job because I was fired because I didn't show up or whatever, right? Okay. But it is also true that you speak euphemistically, you and I do this to others because we're afraid that they're going to be embarrassed. And I'm not embarrassed, but I'm afraid that you're going to be embarrassed. I get this, and you get this too. People say, I don't want to be a burden. Has anybody heard this phrase? I don't want to be a burden, right? Because if I'm a burden to you, then you're going to see me at my most vulnerable, and you might be embarrassed. When Esty and I were dating in high school, I broke my face in a soccer game one day, and I was taken to the hospital. And when I was taken to the hospital, my girlfriend, her name was Esty, took my grandmother, who was there at the game, home. She lived with us at the time. And my grandmother needed some assistance changing her clothes, and she had soiled herself, and she needed help. My sweet 15, 16-year-old girlfriend, who we'd been dating for not that long, cleaned up my grandmother, right? I tell you that as a way of saying, when you tell your need, it can be very embarrassing for yourself. But even if you're not embarrassed, because my grandmother, if you knew her, she sure as hell was not embarrassed, because that's just what happens. We will refrain from telling people things, our real needs, because we're afraid that you might be embarrassed. So this notion of being prepared to state our need openly to others, even if they're embarrassed by it. Have you ever called your parents and spoken euphemistically and you're in need, right? Or you've talked with your boss and you're in need, but you kind of beat around the bush because heaven forbid their child or their direct report or whatever is failing in some capacity because that's going to look bad on them. You know what I mean? So we've got to state it openly, even if folks are going to be embarrassed by it. On the bottom of page 83, last few minutes here, pride hurts, but humility takes the fear out of our introspection, making us courageous and strong. Having humility also makes us patient with ourselves. When we do find things, we probably will see in ourselves. So pride hurts, but humility takes the fear out of a lot of introspection, making us courageous and strong. So that's the antidote, right? If you're proudful, the antidote becomes this humble or set of humble practices. And then on the top of page 84, before we get to prayer, the top of 84, do not try, she writes here, Do not try to do everything at once. Take on only one passion at a time. Learning to love is a slow business. There's a saying in which there's a teacher and a student, and the student asks a peer, hey, what do you know about this teacher? And the peer says, all I know is that guy every year takes on one passion, or one practice, and that's it. And once he figures out how to do that practice over the course of a year, he keeps doing that practice, and the next year he takes on another practice. So 1 year, he doesn't do anything else except try to figure out how to pray. That's it. And once he's mastered that, it might take a couple of years. Only then does he take on fasting, right? So we tend to kind of take it all on at once. Desert tradition is very much aligned to, hey, just do one thing at a time. There's another story of a dad telling his son, will you go clear this field? And the son goes out there and looks at the field and is like, this field is massive. There's no way. It's full of thickets. I cannot clear this field. Look at these trees, and I can't do it. And so every day he goes out there and he takes a nap. And after about a year, his dad comes and says, hey, I'm going to come check out the field you've been working on. And the guy's like, yeah, I mean, you can come look at it, but it's trash. Like, there's thickets, and I mean, I hadn't made much progress at all. And the dad gets out there, and he's like, you've made zero progress. And in fact, what have you been doing? He said, well, I got out here, I get overwhelmed, I'm trying to take it all on at once, and it overwhelms me, and I go to sleep. And the dad said, look, if you just would have cleared enough space every day for you to take a nap on that space, you would have cleared the whole darn field. You know? Don't take it on all at once. That's insane. You're not God. Do one thing. Do one thing. And if it takes you more than a year, it takes you more than a year. Take time. Try to grapple with these practices for a long time. Work on introspection. So we'll start on prayer and finish with prayer next week, if that's okay. And then I promise we'll move quickly through the God section. Because that's mostly a recapitulation. There's a couple of things that we can pull out of that, but it's mostly a recap of some matters. Yeah, let's meet next week. We'll finish out the rest of the book. I know that sounds impossible, and maybe it does. But we'll get as far as we get, and then that'll be that. I really appreciate y'all's patience. Is there last 4 minutes, 3 minutes? Is there any comments, questions, concerns, shenanigans, any takeaways, anything that you want to speak to before we go? Yeah. Susie's sharing that there's a professional, trained, licensed spiritual director who takes directees here at the church. She's fantastic. There's probably, I think she has 4 or 5 directees. Okay, you know of 3 that meet here. So it's not you don't have to go to Dallas or Fort Worth. I mean, you can come just to church, and there's spiritual directors all around. But yeah, for sure, spiritual direction, very good and mandatory, I think, for all pastors. Okay, anything else? Y'all are amazing. Go tassel with the passions in prayer and introspection. Amen. Thank y'all.